Welcome to our Tuesday, April 21st live stream. BP oil spill survivors tell their stories, connecting the dots between exposure and harm. I am your host, Dr. Ricky Ott, the founder and director of the Alert Project and a survivor of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Episode 4 is our last live stream in this series that we have hosted between March 21st, March 24th, and April 21st. This was done intentionally to mark the memorials of our nation's largest oil spills and also to expose and deal with unfinished business from these two disasters. As many of you now know, our national contingency plan for emergency response to oil spills is 26 years old. It's not only outdated, it's unsafe and it endangers lives, as witnesses in previous live streams have attested. Alert is calling for national solidarity with oil spill survivors to demand accountability and system change. On the 10th memorial of the BP disaster, Alert launched its campaign, #What'sThePlan-EPA. This is a bid to ban toxic dispersants for good and build local capacity to better protect our citizens, communities, and tribes from the next oil spill disaster. Today in episode 4, Preventing Harm, we are joined by Lynda Zambrano, founder and executive director of the Northwest and National Tribal Emergency Management Councils. Lynda organized one of the first tribal emergency response commissions on Indian lands. The council also hosts annual conferences to keep tribes informed of best practices and new technologies. Rick Steiner proposed and helped establish the Regional Citizens Advisory Council and the Prince William Sound Science Center after the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. He also helped craft a $1 billion legal settlement between Exxon and the government, with which much of the coastline of the oil spill region was protected. So thank you both for joining our panel today. Lynda, I'm going to share a quick story of when I first met you. It was actually through some Alaska Native friends, and it was at my first National Tribal Emergency Management Council meeting in my home territory of Wisconsin, and this last year. And I was extremely impressed by the people who attended the meeting, the commitment. And then I, had known that you had started this, and I'm really looking forward to you sharing our story. So welcome to the panel.
Thank you, and good morning.
So take it away. How did you start your first council? What have you been doing most recently? Every time I email Lynda, she's like, oh, I'm doing this with face masks. Oh, I'm doing this. So I know we're all kind of tangled up here with oil spills and COVID-19 right now. And I want to do a hats off to the Gulf people, just because I know that many people down there are suffering still these ongoing illnesses and respiratory diseases, which puts them at a double risk right now. And you have the distinction of being the first case in Washington County in your backyard.
Yeah, absolutely. I live here in Snohomish County, the site of the first case in the United States. And the moment that we heard that case was right here, I knew that we were within close proximity of the Tulalip tribes. We were in close proximity of all of our tribes up and down the I-5 corridor. I knew that we had a lot of casinos and a lot of places where there were large congregations of people. And my background's in biology and chemistry, and I've seen some of the things that have happened with these viruses in the past. So I was really quite concerned right out of the gate. And so as an organization, our National Tribal Emergency Management Council stood up our Emergency Operations Center that same week, that very first week of the first case. And we went straight to work in regards to working on preventative measures, sharing information with our tribes, and hoping that we were going to be able to get ahead of the curve. So that's a little bit of the work that we've been doing with the COVID. We've been not only sharing information, but we've been acquiring large volumes of resources. By that first or second week of February, it was being reported that there was a global shortage of N95 masks. But we were able to acquire a volume of them, and we were able to set up checkpoints throughout the state of Washington and deliver those masks to the tribes here when they weren't able to get any at all.
It's so quite amazing story. And how did it all start? Let's scroll back in time to how you got interested in emergency response management.
So the beginning of the story is very interesting. I started in Washington State. I was working for one of our larger tribes. The chief of police sent me to a Homeland Security meeting, of all things. And I got to the Homeland Security meeting, and I walked in, and there were no other females in the room. There were no tribal representatives in the room. And I sat in my first meeting and just listened very carefully to a group of people divide up $5 million between 5 counties, and not a single dollar went to any of the 8 tribes that were located in that 5-county area. And so I took that information back to the chief of police, and I told him that from my understanding, the reason that there were no tribes that were present was because the invitations were sent to emergency management offices. And at that time, there were no offices of emergency management in Indian country in Washington State. And at that point, the chief said, well, that's great information. And so you're going to create an office of emergency management for our tribe. And I want you to take this set of keys and drive to the other 7 tribal nations, explain to them why it's important that they're at the next meeting. And then I want you to be the chairperson of our new tribal subcommittee. And I said to the chief, I said, I know nothing about emergency management. And he said, you'll learn. So that's how it started. And I always say my proudest moment was when I was able to get those other 7 chiefs of police in full uniform to join me at that next Homeland Security meeting. And between the 8 of us, we started something back in 2003 that still exists today.
Why don't we have your first slide? Show us the map.
That would be wonderful.
Story.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the map shows a very small snip of northwest Washington.
That's correct. Yep, that's our
South.
5 counties. And we were region 1 in the state of Washington. It's a 5-county area of Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom, Island, and San Juan counties. And there were 8 tribes that began working together on Homeland Security and emergency management issues. And it was not too shortly after that we learned that public health plays a very important role in every emergency response. And so we, the tribes, were the first to reach out to our public health partners and our Department of Health to establish a relationship with them, to start working on prevention in those particular areas. And I'd like to share a really quick story, since we are talking about oil spill and oil response.
You can go
that in that first couple of years of creating that Office of Emergency Management, we learned of SARA Title III, and we learned of the Community Right to Know Act. And I was on my way home from work one night, and I got a phone call, and it was one of my ham radio operators that was calling me to let me know that the bomb squad had been dispatched to the area where my office was at. And I couldn't imagine any reason why the bomb squad would be heading in that direction. I called our dispatch, and our dispatch said, well, we just sent all of our officers there. They should be there momentarily. And I asked the caller on the phone, what specifically did they say they were dispatching the bomb squad for? And he said a picric acid spill. And they indicated that it had crystallized. So I immediately grabbed my emergency response guide, and I popped it open, and I took a look at picric acid. And then I learned how explosive it was, and that we would potentially be looking at an evacuation area of 1/4 to 1/2 mile around the facility. That was our introduction to SARA Title III and EPGRA. And so From that point forward, I went to the tribal council and I asked them, how many mandatory reporters are you aware of that reside on the reservation? And they told me none. They weren't aware of any. Well, I went back to the Department of Ecology and learned that we had 22 mandatory reporters on our reservation alone. And we were not communicating with them at all in regards to prevention or response plans. And so I saw that our organization ties into the work that you're doing very, very well, especially under the Emergency Support Function 10 with hazardous materials and with the chemical spills and some of the oil spills. And so I wanted to share that with you because it really emphasized the importance of why we needed to get involved. Our law enforcement wasn't familiar with the ERG. Our membership, our people weren't familiar with the mandatory reporters that were operating on our reservation. And all of this was critical information that I think that our community needed to be aware of, and especially our emergency management department.
And I want people, while they're listening to Lynda's story, this is about tribes and tribal organizing, but there is a parallel structure called the State Emergency Response Commission versus the Tribal Emergency Response Commission. And there's supposed to be these local emergency planning committees. There are, except they usually deal with floods, fires, earthquake, and think about the communications that you get from them during these events. Now switch in your mind. If there's a man-made disaster, an oil spill, a chemical disaster, the communications just goes down because our local emergency planning committees at the very level of our municipal responders really aren't trained for this level of response, for the oil spill response, for the hazardous materials response. And so listen to Lynda's story and think about, she did this for the tribes. This is what Alert Project is trying to help people do for the local community and the tribes that still aren't all the way as advanced in preparation as Lynda has helped make them. And then you had a couple other wake-up calls, and I forget the order now. Was it the Steiner spill first and then FEMA? Okay.
It was the Steiner. We had a 65-foot Steiner go down in our marina. And thank goodness, did the work that we had already started with the other 7 tribes. And when we reached out to the Department of Ecology and talked to them about these 22 mandatory reporters on the reservation, what they did was they said, let's start working together for the potential of a spill in your marina. So they equipped all of our tribes with trailers that were outfitted with response equipment, materials, and supplies. It was, I kid you not, it was no later than 3 weeks after we got our trailer and that we did our training with the Department of Ecology, and we learned how to deploy our boom, that 65-foot Steiner went down in our marina. And we were able to, without having to wait for FEMA to respond or for the state to be able to get equipment to us, our staff was able to deploy that boom, contain that spill. And we were able to actually save the fisheries season that year for all of the tribes in the Puget Sound. They had told us that if we had not reacted as quickly as we had and that oil had made it to land, we would not have had a fishery that year. So we were just very fortunate to have been engaged, to raise awareness to these issues and to acquire the materials and supplies that we needed to be better prepared.
Amazing.
And so with that, we talked about those 8 tribes. And if we want to put up my next slide,
wait, before we get to there, I just want to
Sure.
jump off something that you just said, because up in Alaska 32 years ago now, none of the fishermen were trained. And we had Exxon Valdez oil spill in our backyard, and nobody taught us. I mean, we had to learn by doing. And now, of course, we have people that are on call. Literally, the fishing fleet is on call, members of it. They're trained annually, updated training, HAZWOPER training, the hazardous waste operator training, but it's all like in hindsight. And you guys were fortunate that you had this 3-week window, and it's like, I mean, maybe not fortunate of your spill, but my God, you were there. And we're still having trouble right now. There's a spill at the Alyeska Marine Tanker Terminal in Alaska. And golly gee, they're a little late on responding to it. Again, I mean, it's just, I don't know if you have anything to contribute to that, Rick, but being up in Anchorage, actually in Alaska. But anyway, they're at the Marine Terminal responding to a spill right now at Alyeska. So go ahead with your next amazing story.
So it didn't take very long before tribes outside of that 5-county area started to pay attention to what we were doing and started asking if there was a way that they could join the group and that we could be working with tribes in Eastern Washington and down in Southern Washington. And so in 2003, we formalized the group and we became the official tribal subcommittee of Region 1 Homeland Security. But by 2008, we had tribes that were in Oregon and in Idaho, some tribes that were up in Alaska that were asking, boy, we've heard about what you guys are doing in Washington. How can we be a part of your group? And so what we did was we expanded our charter and our bylaws, and we formally incorporated in 2008, and we became what was officially known as the Northwest Tribal Emergency Management Council. And through that work, we have continued to expand. We call ourselves the tribal FEMA overlay for Region 10, because FEMA Region 10 also covers Washington, Alaska, Idaho, and Oregon. And so for those first 5 years, the 4 states worked very closely together. We hosted conferences each year, and we started inviting people from across the United States to attend our conferences, including people from FEMA headquarters, as well as some of our other federal partners. And in 2009, we were asked if there was any way that we could consider expanding our charter and bylaws again and roll out a national project and help tribes across the United States. So in 2010, the board of directors agreed to do that, and we created the National Tribal Emergency Management Council. And so if we want to maybe move to the next slide, I believe our next slide will share with you some of the work that we do through the national organization. A lot of people, when they think of emergency management, they just think of the one singular discipline of emergency management. But as emergency managers, and like myself, operating an emergency operations center right now, we have to look at all of the different emergency support functions. And so, as you heard me state earlier, in any type of a disaster that we have, there's usually a public health component. And so just by looking at this slide, you can see where in emergency support function 5, we have emergency management. Under 6 and 8, we have 2 emergency support functions that specifically relate to health and human services that need to be coordinated during any kind of an emergency event. A lot of the work that we do, again, as I was saying about oil, is under emergency support function 10. So I think that as we are able to help educate and teach people that emergency management is more than just being someone who's maybe perhaps writing a preparedness plan, but also can be someone who's in the position of identifying potential problems with any one of these areas, and then looking at how we can put preventative measures in place for any one of these. And then also understanding that we will need to coordinate with all of these different disciplines in a large scale event, the more I believe that we can be successful in emergency management.
And I want to talk specifically about your public health and medical services, because I want to relate it to what happened during the BP oil disaster. I was down in the Gulf Coast communities. I know Rick was too. I stayed a full year down there because I could not believe what was unfolding. And I kept trying to prevent it. And what was unfolding was, as I moved across 4 states, the exact same symptoms that are common to oil disaster, to oil exposure. So it was the respiratory systems, the central nervous system, systems of headaches and dizziness and nausea, these horrible skin rashes bordering on lesions, cough, sore throat, burning eyes. And it was just too consistent across too many states. But the thing is that it was also somewhat normal. What people did was they normalized their symptoms. Oh, I have a headache. Oh, I have the BP syndrome. Oh, let me go to the local pharmacy and get some medicine for that. People did not go to the emergency room. Why should they? They're poor, number one. The emergency room might be really far away. You don't go to the emergency room for every little sniffle or headache that you get. And so these states with they were supposed to be looking for the public health emergency that was going to come from this. They never saw it. They never saw it because they were looking at the emergency response room data. Their comb, if you will, was missing too many of its teeth. And the whole disaster slipped right through their net. They never saw it. And meanwhile, I'm on the ground thinking, why isn't a public health person, official stepping up here? So in this case, the local people, the local emergency planning committees, if you spin it to the municipal ground, would have said, there's a problem. I mean, if your tribes had seen this many members getting sick, they would have said, there's a problem, and you would have done something. And BP disaster completely missed it, triggering, I believe, because of the blood work that was done, oil in their blood, it showed oil in people's bodies. And from that, not being treated properly by environmental medicine doctors, these toxins lingered and are contributing, I believe, to the long-term suffering and cancers and these devastating, debilitating diseases that are going on in the Gulf today. This is what we're trying to prevent. And it takes local people, not the emergency managers at the response level, at the regional level, at the national level. They're not going to see this. We see it in the Gulf. So yeah, so thank you for that. And I think you had another, anyway, go on to, sorry to interrupt, but go on to your next slide deck maybe.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. And so that is exactly what these, with our council, what we've done is that we have these monthly meetings and we have ex officio seats for each one of those emergency support functions. And so we actually invite a representative from the State Emergency Management Division, from the State Department of Ecology, from the State Department of Health, from each one of those emergency support functions, including we have military representatives that join us as well. And so that's what those meetings are all about, is making sure that we're able to get all of the appropriate people at the table for planning purposes. So with this slide, very quickly, I'm going to go through these next two slides just to show you a little bit about what kind of work that we do. So we assist in the development of plans. We assist one another in raising awareness to specific issues. For example, if we've got a problem with some type of oil spill, then we're able to bring all of the correct subject matter experts to the table for that. We educate each of our communities at the local level by doing our community emergency response team training. We have an entire cadre of tribal trainers, and so we make our education very tribal specific and tribal relevant. And then we build teams. And so for the public health piece of it, some of the things that I've been doing during this COVID response, I've had a number of physicians, retired doctors, nurses that have contacted me and asked if there's a place where they could fit into the overall response structure and be able to aid and assist. And so we've been able to place some of those volunteers with the tribal nations to be able to help them with this COVID response.
But I want to emphasize here that what we're seeing now with COVID shows an overall lack of preparedness at our local level in general to step up and be informed and be aware that this is real and to know what to do immediately. I mean, not a month after the disaster, but immediately. And this is an ongoing training and education. It's not just something that happens overnight. So these are teams that need to be set up. So continue, because you've got some other great info.
Ricky, I would like to add at this point in time too, that what we are gearing up for with the National Tribal Emergency Management Council is the second wave of COVID. I think that there's just not enough emphasis that's being put on the second wave that we are about to see. And so with our committee, with our council, recognizing that, we're putting all of the measures in place right now to be able to assist the tribes over the next 2 to 3 months instead of trying to play catch up. So
And
I just wanted to share that, to make
what
that.
Lynda is talking about here is look up, people, the Spanish influenza. It's
Absolutely.
much more similar to that than a normal fall flu virus season, okay? So basically what happens is the virus gets exterminated, people get better. It doesn't get exterminated all the way though. So it either evolves or it lingers in a few people and then everybody's fine and mingling again. And the next thing you know, you have the second wave. So that's what we got to watch out for. Anyway, carry on, Lynda. Thank you.
You bet. And Ricky, I think that people need to understand we haven't exterminated anything with COVID. All we've done is had a lot of people stay at home so they don't get exposed. But they need to realize it hasn't been exterminated. It hasn't gone away. It's still in our community. And once we reopen the community, people are going to get infected. That's just the truth of the matter. And so instead of burying our heads in the sand, let's do what we need to do to be prepared. And so that's what our council is focusing on right now. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that, because it's kind of a really important note that I think that we all need to be paying attention to right now.
Mm-hmm.
So with my next slide, if I can get that back up, and we'll get through these next couple real quick. We provide communications network for the tribes. And so with our Emergency Operations Center, I'm communicating with tribes all across the country right now to determine if there's any needs that are out there. And this doesn't just hold true for COVID. We're here 24/7 for any event that's happening in the United States with our tribes. We provide a link to resources. We help our local tribes get in contact with their local, state, and federal partners to get resources to them. We provide templates for plans. So a tribe that doesn't have a comprehensive emergency management plan, we can just send one over free of charge, and they can take a look at that and modify that in any way that suits them for their tribe. We also have a complete set of healthcare policies and procedures for health clinics. People wouldn't normally think of emergency management of having that. But we have designed a template packet of healthcare policies for any clinic, dental clinic that wants to take a look at those and enhance perhaps the policies that they currently have. We maintain essential databases, so we know who to call upon in regards to our volunteers, the resources, shelters if we need to stand them up. We maintain multiple websites, and we've got two that we primarily work with, and that's the one that's on this slide, the NTEMC.org. And we also have an NWTEMC.org, which is our Northwest Tribal Emergency Management Council. We have Facebook, and we're out there on Twitter as well. And we meet monthly, and every year we host an annual conference. A lot of tribes, when we first started on this work, didn't think that they had tribal critical infrastructure. But what we were able to really demonstrate for the federal government is that the majority of critical infrastructure in this nation is located on or within close proximity of our tribal nations. That the Grand Coulee Dam is a great example of that. And so we shared that. I've got a photo of a casino in here because most people don't recognize casinos as being critical infrastructure, but some of our casinos have become the #1 or #2 largest employer in their counties. And without those casinos, those economies would crash in those counties. And so we were able to convince the federal government that they do need to be looking at the economic impact if there was a disaster to occur with one of these casinos. And we're seeing that right now with the closure of all of our casinos across the country with COVID. My next slide. We educate and we put a strong emphasis on education. And so we have partnered with many universities across the United States for the further development of what we call a tribal credential in emergency management. So we will be standing up a CEM for tribal emergency managers very, very soon. Next slide. And that's,
I think we can
and
go.
that brings us, yep, that brings us to our next presenter. And so Ricky, if you have any questions for me, I'd be more than happy to answer those. And if not, I'll defer over to Rick.
Why don't we just march along with Rick? I do want to emphasize that I really like the native model of working to educate future disaster responders. And I'm going to be hopefully working with Lynda with that for next fall school season. So we'll see. So Rick and I, we could go full panel if it's not a problem for a sec here. I want Rick to be able to introduce himself, and then we can take our virtual tour to Alaska. But Rick and I were both commercial fishing before the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and we had licenses, and there we were suddenly with the Exxon Valdez in our backyard. So as we've learned in all these disasters, there are people who step up and immediately start helping others. And Rick was definitely one of those. So Rick, why don't you just maybe, I don't know when you want the map up, but go ahead and introduce yourself a little, and then we only have one slide for Rick. It's the map. It's mostly going to be his story about regional citizen advisory councils. So Rick.
Thanks very much. And Lynda, that was a great presentation. It's great to know that there is such a group as the Tribal Emergency Management Council. Yeah, my other job, having lived in Prince William, lived in Alaska most of my life, in the Arctic and Kodiak and other places, I was stationed in Prince William Sound for about 15 years, both before Exxon Valdez and after for the University of Alaska. I was the Marine advisor for the region. And actually 2 or 3 years prior to the Exxon Valdez, we realized that there were issues at the nation's largest tanker terminal, both with the terminal management as well as oil spill prevention, response preparedness, tanker management, and such like that. And so I actually tried about 3 years prior to Exxon Valdez to form a Citizens Advisory Council for the terminal and the tankers. The industry told me to get lost. The sympathetic state government at the time told me to get lost, that there was no interest, and that was a sympathetic administration at the time. So we were unsuccessful. And at that time, we were trying to base it on the Shetland Sullomvo oil terminal model. But needless to say, then with Exxon Valdez in March of 1989, we had an agreement between the oil industry and the stakeholders, mainly the commercial fishing industry, within 2 months after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, to form a Citizens Advisory Council. And the whole notion is not just better response preparedness, which we've been talking about a lot this morning, but it's also in preventing disasters. And that is where 90% of my interest and efforts have been since. And it's been very successful in Prince William Sound. We have not had another Exxon Valdez, fortunately. And
We've come close a couple times. Yeah.
We've been close. We could have one tonight. But I think a lot of that is due to the vigilance and the oversight of the citizens through the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. And again, this was established in 1989 via a contract between the citizens, stakeholder groups, and the oil industry, having nothing to do whatsoever with the federal or state government. That was a contractual agreement we agreed to between the stakeholders and the oil industry. And then the next year, one of our senators put that in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, just to make sure that if this agreement between the oil industry and the citizens were to somehow be threatened in the future, that the federal government would step in and require the establishment. So the US government required the establishment of these groups. What we found throughout the world, we've been doing this work globally for years, is that there's interest in citizen stakeholders having a say. If you exclude citizens from these large industrial projects early on, you can have a lot of social strife, a lot of economic turmoil, you can have strikes, you can even have violence, such as in Bougainville in 1990 or 89, 90, 91, where thousands of people were killed in an uprising against a mine that could have been averted had they had legitimate citizen engagement between the mine company and the local citizens. So I think industry is generally coming to recognize that their social license to operate these days around the world is utterly dependent on having a legitimate engagement, authentic, credible, independent engagement function with local citizens. Without that, they're left with this cozy relationship between government and industry, which can drift off into a corrupt, complacent system, which is what we had here in Alaska prior to Exxon Valdez. And to be quite honest with you, is where we're drifting back today with the Trump administration and the current state of Alaska administration. So,
well, Rick, I would just like to add in here that we're already there. We've already drifted back. And I say this because of what happened during the BP disaster with dispersant use.
right.
If there had been independent citizen advisory councils in the different 4 states working together with, like Lynda's model, where you all work with that, where you assist everybody, then the industry might have heard people say no. It might have heard people say, we are getting sick. Something is wrong. We think it's from these dispersants that you're spraying. That was not the question that was asked in May. The first question was, what is this stuff? And I helped everybody understand that this was some very toxic chemicals, and it was used to literally break up the surface slick, put it into the air, put it into the water column under the surface. And everybody was like, you mean it just sort of spreads it around? And I'm like, yeah. And it's making us sick? I said, likely. And then I think, if the way that what's happened right now is our national contingency plan, the rulemaking for dispersants that was started under the last administration never was finalized by the last administration or this administration. So in limbo, as it were, we default to the old rules, which allow expedited use and unlimited use of toxic dispersants in oil spills. And when you're mentioning about social conflict, there is going to be a huge uproar in the Gulf if this is ever tried again on a massive scale, because people darn well know what happened this last time. So anyway, I am really interested in, we both worked after the BP disaster. There was interest to get a citizen advisory council in the Gulf. And it came to nothing. And I think based on your expertise with these councils over the decades actually, it seems to me if you were going to create one out of the blue, what kind of improvements would you make on past models, including the one in Alaska, for example? It's not just to take this waffle and redo it, I don't think.
No, that's a good question. And there's been continual adaptation and improvement in the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. And I'd encourage anybody to go to their website, www.pwsrcac.org, and get familiar with the background of the council, who's on it, how their people are appointed. As they've got a number of things right, and that is that the governments and industry do not appoint the representatives on the council. The individual stakeholder groups appoint them. And so they're ultimately responsible to their own stakeholder groups, not government or industry. There's funding provided, about $4 million a year at arm's length. One thing that I would recommend to be improved is the funding stream could come from the National Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund to the councils. It's the nickel a barrel tax that comes into the federal fund. It's a $5 or $6 billion fund right now. It needs to be used for prevention rather than just hanging out waiting for the next big disaster and then pouring a bunch of money into it, which usually doesn't do very much except cause more problems. But there are legitimate funding mechanisms like that that could support these councils. And you're right, Ricky, a number of us tried hard in the Gulf, even before the Gulf spill, but more strongly afterwards, to form a Gulf of Mexico Regional Citizens Advisory Council. And it's important to note that industry objected, and even the Obama administration dismissed the effort at the time. So I was actually shocked that we were not successful at establishing a Gulf of Mexico Council. We had one within 2 months, 2 or 3 months after the Exxon Valdez. Why in the Gulf? A much bigger spill, many more people involved, a lot of more complexities there in a way. Were we not successful at doing that?
I think I know the answer now in hindsight. And part of it relates to this separation of citizens and government. And the trouble is that it goes all the way back to OPA 90, believe it or not, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill, where in the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, it says, okay, citizen complacency between government industry, big problem. We need citizens to combat that. So we are going to bring in the local emergency planning committees and the CERCs and the Turks, okay, the state emergency response commissions. That's under a separate law. That's SARA Title III. But that's okay to bring it in, and it is in our national contingency plan. Here it is, these local emergency planning committees, but they're not funded extra for oil spill response. And most of the communities treat oil spill response not like floods, fires, and earthquakes, where you need to be, prepared now, any minute for a disaster. It's like, oh, we'll be lucky, maybe we'll be lucky and it will never happen. Maybe the pipes in our neighborhoods will never rupture, like what happened in Mayflower, Arkansas. Wake up call there, So because they weren't funded, I think because the local cities were not funded for this extra disaster response, they wanted in on the citizen advisory councils. And this would have been a total disruption of the whole notion of independent oversight of government and industry. So what ALERT is trying to do now is separate these two concepts. We get the citizens through the citizen advisory councils, or the groups like Emily Harris talked about in episode 2, I believe, where you can go through the super fund to get a parallel structure, these citizen advisory groups, get them funded and get the local emergency planning, get the local government funded and get all the tribes funded, all through the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund or some funding mechanism to prevent these things. Yeah. I totally agree with you. 90% of it's prevention. Where is it? It's not happening.
Yeah.
So
that's the critical thing. The emergency response infrastructure we have in the nation right now is focused just on emergency response, not on prevention. And that seems to be the real gap. The oil industry here and all industry around the world pretty well recognize that prevention is the key, and that they can put all this money into it, but that last 10% risk reduction is the more expensive part, and they don't want to do that. But if you have citizens overseeing that, the ones with the most at stake, quite frankly,
yep.
The fishing industry, the indigenous communities, the municipalities, the aquaculture corporations, environmental groups, whoever.
Tourism.
Tourism, youth, women, with most at stake, they have a lot to say about this, and they should be engaged in preventing these things. And again, it has worked here in Alaska over the last 30 years, knock, knock. I hope it continues to. The model is sound. It can be exported elsewhere. We have been marginally successful in a few places around the world with it. But I would say that generally the time to set one of these things up is before you have a catastrophic incident rather than after and during. But then you question whether you have the political impetus and political drive and motivation to actually recognize that there's a hole that you need to fill with a citizens council. But some companies are getting there. They're starting to recognize that there's a new way of doing business in this century. The oil companies may be the last to come around to that, but we have to hold their feet to the fire and make them do it.
Well, the other impetus is literally hundreds of thousands of people sick and dying across 4 states, in coastal communities in the Gulf of Mexico area right now. And that has, I think, there's a film that's coming out called The Cost of Silence. And when it premiered at Sundance this year, it's an expose film, filmed 9.5 years in secret. I'm in it, bringing in the, sort of the Alaska story of, well, this happened and this happened. And, but anyway, the point of it is that it is this really heart-wrenching expose. 5 audiences at Sundance were sobbing. So, and then they wanted to do something. So we'll put that website up, thecostofsilencefilm.com. But that leverage, when we screened, the last one was at Salt Lake City and with a normal audience. So normal people, everyday people, 340 people. And when I was saying this could happen in your backyard, all of a sudden this hand shoots up and it's this woman and she says, we've already had this happen in our backyard. And I'm like, you're miles inland, what happened? And she goes, a pipeline ruptured from Chevron and our neighborhoods got sick. People in our neighborhoods got sick. We had the headaches, just like in this film, and the government and the industry wouldn't listen to us. People don't realize that how, we are in a risk-based society, culture, basically. And you have to normalize some of these risks in order to live. Otherwise, you would never leave your house. But I mean, one of the risks we live with are pipelines laced through our communities right now. Tankers going by if you live by a coastline. I mean, this is for real. We need to prepare for this. So I want to, I don't know if you had anything more to add about citizen advisory councils, but Rick, I think we have time. Let's just talk about the settlement funds, because settlement funds, the federal government, the state governments always end up in a lawsuit with the spiller, and there's funds afterward. And to me, these are can be multi-billion dollar pots of money, definitely multi-million. And they're both a curse and a blessing. And you were able to channel some of that spill fund money to a very positive outcome. So could you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. One of the big questions out of these, after about a month of Exxon Valdez and all the chaos and in the attempted response, it was obvious that that wasn't going to work, and it really didn't. And so then the question a number of us had was, well, what can we do positively for the environment to help it recover with its own natural healing abilities? And the first thing that came up was, well, we need to at least protect it from additional harm, like the Hippocratic Oath, first do no more harm. So at least we had to stop inflicting more environmental harm on Prince William Sound, thus allowing it to heal more quickly than it would have with the additional harm. And so it was obvious we had just had clear-cut logging start along the coastal temperate rainforest and in the area just the year prior to the spill, ironically. And we recognized that we ought to be able to get hundreds of millions of dollars from Exxon to flow these funds to the Alaska Native corporations that own the lands, to allow them to earn funds without damaging their lands. And that was the concept. And ultimately, there were some 600,000 acres of coastal habitat within the spill region protected, with about around $500 million of the $1 billion settlement. The same model was used in the Gulf of Mexico, that basically we need to reduce additional environmental harm in the system, therefore allowing it to recover. We can't go build more seals and sea otters and killer whales and intertidal habitat. You just cannot fix what is broken in these industrial disasters, but you can protect systems. And so we launched this effort, and it was marginally successful in that realm. The same model can be used around the world in restoration. Marine systems are very different than terrestrial systems. You can't just go plant more trees when you have a forest cut down. It's more difficult. So in the marine system, so it was modestly successful. There were a lot of holes that we still could have filled in the restoration program, which is still ongoing today. They still have another $100 million in the bank. But the main thing I think they should have done that they didn't is establish marine protected areas to protect critical habitat areas, at least in time-in areas, to allow the systems to heal better, but they weren't able to do that yet. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, some of those areas like Barataria Bay right now are being flooded, and the dolphins that were already sick and injured from the spill are like 300 of them died additionally last year. I mean, that very easily could have been a protected area just for a while, even just for a while. But anyway, that was a great idea. And I just wanted to let people know that these big pots of money, the bigger the spill, obviously, the bigger the pot. So in some of these spills, like the BP Whiting refinery spill in Lake Michigan in 2000, I think it was 14, and the Enbridge oil, tar sands oil spill from the pipeline rupture back in 2010, those also had what's called consent order and consent agreement and final orders, CAFOs, that really almost slipped by the public. And I mentioned the ones in Michigan because, well, the Great Lake area, because citizens reached out to Alert and said, what are these things? Can we get in on this money at all and do something with it? And Alert worked with the citizen groups in the western part of the Great Lakes. And one of the things that was asked for in both of those two CAFOs was citizen oversight councils. And of course, maximum fines. So, I mean, we are asking multiple ways to say the citizens want in on this, and that door has been barred and locked. So we are going to try to break that open. And thank you very much, Rick. And I am going to summarize both of our panels now with some quick slides here. It's been very inspiring, you two. So I think the first slide might be Alaska, just to show you that Exxon Valdez oil spill was actually, that arrow represents about 1,300 miles as the crow flies. It oiled about 3,600 miles or so of coastline. That's what Rick was talking about with some of that with the trees and stuff. And Prince William Sound is over there by on the right with Cordova and Valdez. But anyway, all right, so on we go to our summary slides here. So what we heard about was the Oil Pollution Act and Superfund, or SARA Title III. Under the Oil Pollution Act, there was a third layer of response planning that was added. That's the colored area at the bottom. So starting from the top, before OPA 90, we had one national team and one national contingency plan. And when I talk about the plan being outdated, that's the one, okay? Last updated 26 years ago. From that plan, that one national plan, stems regional plans that are adapted, like what Lynda talked about. You adapted for your region. And that was it before OPA 90. Well, the problem is that oil does not spill in a region. It does not spill at the national level. It spills in somebody's backyard. And so OPA 90 went and added the third layer and mandated area plans and teams. And specifically now, if you look over at Superfund and SARA Title III, which is in that orange color, it added in the local government with state emergency response commissions and the local emergency planning committees, the LEPCs, and the tribal emergency response commissions. So OPA 90 basically blended the Clean Water Act, which is OPA 90, and Superfund. Okay, these are two separate acts of Congress. It blended them with this mandate, which is now reflected in our area contingency plans, which are unfortunately not developed by local citizens, but rather by industry, except in Alaska, okay? And except on tribal lands where the tribes have their say. So what we are trying to do with this beyond these live streams now is to get people to take action to work to develop their own local capacity. And we're going to be right there with you helping make this happen. Local citizen advisory councils, local citizen advisory groups, and tribes and municipalities. Okay, next slide. Shows this is about dispersant spraying. In our first 3 episodes, really 4 if you count the press conference, we talked a lot about toxic dispersants, what they were, how they were potentially affecting people's lives, people's livelihoods, killing people. And this series of photo documentation is provided by Lori Bosarge, who was with us in episode 2. And she had been sprayed directly by dispersants, which she photo documented occurring in August 2010. The significance of that date is it was late August, a month past when the official word held that spraying was over. If there had been local citizen advisory councils and the municipal groups and the tribal groups all active, they could all have said dispersant spraying is not over. Why? Because dispersants were pre-authorized under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And that means that, that they can be sprayed anywhere, anytime. And this, in fact, is what has been ongoing ever since the BP disaster. If oil pops up after a big hurricane or a big storm or a big blow, boom. And there's this telltale foam of oil and dispersants, which was actually tested in 2012, and a lab confirmed it. So this is ongoing to this day. What we're trying to do as a result of this is ban, revoke pre-authorization of dispersants. This was not mandated. It was allowed under the Clean Water Act, not mandated. Okay, so our next slide shows that unfortunately, because dispersant use is pre-authorized, this has allowed the federal government to get fairly creative, okay? And the federal government basically was caught with its pants down, as was the industry, on April 20th, 2010, when the BP Deepwater Horizon well blowout occurred. So, you know, three-ring circus was going on. We all remember that, but probably people don't know that the Department of Interior, acting on its own in fall, November of 2010, sent out a notice to lessees of oil and gas operators and lease people who are leasing the outer continental shelf and doing federal oil and gas leases. And the mandate basically called for subsea utility equipment, including hydraulic power, hydrate control, things that we know were missing back in April, and dispersant injection equipment. The science showing that dispersant use subsea 1 mile down was absolutely ineffectual because of the tremendous blowout pressure and the cold water and the depth. The oil dispersion was actually controlled by temperature and pressure, not dispersants. Secondly, the dispersants are toxic, okay? The science came out literally years later on this. So the Department of Interior has gone rogue on us. There is no plan. This is not in the current outdated National Contingency Plan. There's no science to support this, and there was absolutely no public process for this. So this is another thing that we, Alert Project, is hoping to work with people to prevent and stop before it gets really going at all. This is totally unnecessary. It's just not helpful, and it's more harm than good. Okay, so the next slide is now about a stellar example from the Pacific Northwest again, where the Makah tribe has insisted on their 1858 treaty rights to have a say in whether or not dispersants are used in their traditional use territory, which extends out into the oceans. In the case of the Makah, they were able to extend that boundary and prove traditional use all the way out to the exclusive economic zone, 200 miles out, and then in the Straits of Juan de Fuca to the US-Canadian border. And this is something that I think the tribes could be also doing in the rest of the United States, in Indian territory, which includes the marine part. It's not all land-based. So this is another thing we're all hoping to work on together. And then the next slide is, I think, about, yes. One of the last things is that it's not just about fixing things from the Exxon Valdez and the BP disaster. It's also about fixing our whole entire national contingency plan, which literally is based on last century's science and technology. And really, it's only geared for conventional oil, not tar sands oil, not oil that sinks, not oil that explodes. Okay, so it is seriously outdated. Besides that, what I've learned about is that every single oil disaster with the contract workers are basically disposable. They're treated as disposable. During the BP disaster, they were told if they wear respirators, their jobs would be terminated. That's how pathetic it was. So I even talked to one contractor who said, yeah, we got all the personal protective equipment on our last day, months in. On our last day, they got it just so the industry could, basically save their butt if there's a court case. Yeah, we gave them equipment. Well, come on. So what I've learned about and what I would like to include in the updates to the National Contingency Plan is what Massachusetts has. It's called a semi-privatized cleanup program. Specifically, it's called the Licensed Site Professional Association. And this came about just like most oil spill disasters, and there's improvements after the fact. So they had an oil spill in the Buzzards Bay area in the 1990s, and people got sick. The first responders got sick. The nearby residents got sick. And it was like, how are we going to do this differently? This is what Massachusetts came up with. There are 5 main entities or players in this program. They're highlighted in orange and in bold. So one is that they're state contractors. That's number one. And all emergency response is done through state contractors. And the state contractors are required to have at least one licensed site professional in their firm. If the disaster is big, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, it doesn't matter. You put on more licensed site professionals. These licensed site professionals actually oversee the response, not the spiller, and they sign off on what's clean. They're also responsible for strict procedures for training. So here we would get full HAZWOPER training, not the Valdez exemption, which the industry still loves to use 4 hours instead of 40. That's what was going on down in the Gulf Coast during the BP disaster until we got that blocked. Finally, it took us about 6 weeks to get the full 40 hours, and then only for offshore workers. But anyway, licensed sites professional also provide the personal protective equipment. They maintain and take care of that equipment, and they provide for healthcare. So it's, by the way, the industry pays for this, okay? This whole program. But there's a separation of the payer and who's responsible for actually conducting the program. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection audits and enforces the program, and it rehires contractors every 5 years. That's part of the deal. During the rehiring process, there's an independent state board that holds meetings and controls the licensure and complaints. And at these meetings, citizens can bring their complaints. And the citizens are the 5th players in this then. 1, 2, 3, yeah, there, I have them all. And the citizens, so if you happen to, you were a contractor who didn't maybe receive proper protective equipment, or somehow you got sick and you felt, oh, that licensed site professional didn't actually take care of you, or the residents in the nearby homes, if this is a pipeline rupture in your backyard, like what happened in Mayflower, Arkansas, you weren't evacuated properly, or something didn't happen right, you can complain. And that licensed site professional association may not get their contract re-upped, okay? Or it may get re-upped with conditions or something, so that there is actually a feedback mechanism and a loop on this for liability, for doing the right thing, for actually protecting people's health and well-being. And I'm talking about responders and residents now, not what we saw during the BP disaster. That was an absolute and utter tragedy, as was the Enbridge, Michigan one, the Arkansas one. I was at all of these, okay? Everyone I've seen is just a tragedy in the making. This is totally preventable. We need to separate the worker, the industry from the workers, the people, the workers and the residents actually, from both the spiller and the politics. and all the politics. So finally, I think our summary slides, and now we're almost to an hour here, so this is all good. Just want to summarize the slide, our call to action. So the Alert Project actually launched a campaign on the 10th memorial of the BP disaster. That's our hashtag What's the Plan EPA campaign. Please go to our website, alertproject.org. You can go to the campaign page. You have to subscribe to, well, I'm getting ahead of the story here. Okay, so what we're trying to do is have a call to action. And these are the physical things we're trying to manifest. We're trying to increase local capacity with an ask to Congress to fund building that local capacity through the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. We're trying to change the rules governing dispersant use. Alert actually has a lawsuit right at the moment, but we certainly don't want to wait for that lawsuit with EPA to demand that EPA finalize its rules governing dispersant use. That could take a while. There's plenty we can do in the interim. So we want to ask our own states to revoke dispersant pre-authorization. I'll be doing that here in Washington state. We want to ask EPA to finalize the rules. It doesn't have to just be through a lawsuit. All people could be calling and saying, EPA, finalize during this administration. We're hearing from the inside right now, oh, that's going to be done in 2021. Well, that might be a different administration. Can't make promises for a different administration. We've had 4 years to do this. Ask Congress and the Interior Department to prevent use of subsea dispersant injection. And then we're working on updating the whole national plan based on 21st century science and technology. We want to do real-time air monitoring and evidence-based action like we heard about in episode 1 with Dr. Ira Leifer. There's ways now to be on the grounds in real time measuring air quality. I bet the tribes already do this. You want to know what people are being exposed to in their homes, what workers are being exposed to, if it's separate from the community, and you want to take evidence-based action, not like what happened in Mayflower, Arkansas, after the Exxon Pegasus tar sands oil disaster, where elementary community was downwind of the fumes and the kids started throwing up. And EPA came in and right with Exxon at its shoulder, took air quality measurements up high, up at the ceilings of the classrooms, not down where the kids were sitting, down at their desks where the oil tends to sink, and met the standards. You know, there shouldn't be any problem. Kids must have food poisoning. We don't need to see that kind of stuff happening. We want to bring in the semi-privatized licensed site professional program to protect all of our workers everywhere during any oil spill. And we want response plans that are with citizen oversight for tar sands, oil, and for frack gas. I mean, come on, we want 21st century science and technology. We certainly have it. Let's use it. So this plan, some of the action things you can do to help us literally protect lives. The next oil disaster could be in your backyard. So please consider donating $10, $25, $50. Every little bit helps. Your tax deductible contribution will go to 4 things: preventing use of toxic dispersants in oil spill response, updating our emergency response plans, like I just talked about. Not only that, but also training, bringing accessible science and legal tools to those who need it the most in the frontline communities. Lynda got a little taste of some of this at the National Tribal Emergency Management Council last August, some of Alert's toxic trespass trainings. And finally, to invest in local citizens to minimize risk of harm from that next oil disaster. Now, I realize that these are unsettled times. And if you can't donate now, we totally understand and get it. But there's other things you could do, like follow us on Facebook or Twitter, subscribe to Alert for updates, and to get our local action toolkits, which we will be building out as we go on now. Probably in the future, we're going to have some more of these live streams as we get more local. I would like to see people with starting up local citizen advisory councils or these LEPCs talking with people who've already done this. What can we learn from each other? How do we do this? I can see more live streams for this. But for right now, I want to remind everybody that all of our recordings, including this one, will be posted on Alert's YouTube channel. Please invite your friends to watch them and subscribe. And the reason I'm pushing all this is because allies like you are absolutely critical to making all this happen. You care. You care about your families, your lives, your communities. Please join us. We care too. So help us meet our fundraising goal on Facebook. We have a Facebook campaign going now or later. Help us, contribute what you can. It would be very much appreciated. Just taking action in some way. So with that, I want to thank the panel very much for their insight and their inspiration and their enthusiasm. Thank you for joining us, all listeners. And this concludes episode 4. Thank you very much.